Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Debaters Council's Motion Debrief series on the Vijitha Weerasinghe Memorial Challenge Trophy 2026. My name is Gavin Senarathne. I am a debater for the University of Mortua and also the former coach of Vidyalaya Colombo and Royal College Colombo. The motion is the prepared motion for the tournament, which is this House as a developing nation would attempt to emulate the economic and cultural strategies of the four Asian tigers as opposed to a Western style development strategy that emphasizes establishing strong democratic institutions, gradual market reform, civil liberties, and human rights protections as preconditions for economic progress. If that was too long for you, it's probably in the description below as well, so you can go back and read that. Now, the good thing about this motion is that the counterfactual has already been established. What I mean by the counterfactual is the thing that opposition will be advocating for. So you've got all of the characteristics of a Western style development strategy. What this means is that the first thing that you should do is to identify what the proposition case is or what the proposition stance is. Namely, what are the economic and cultural strategies of the four Asian tigers? The precondition to that is to identify who the four Asian tigers are. In this case, it is Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Okay, so what are the economic and cultural strategies used by the four Asian tigers? And more importantly, why are they called the four Asian tigers? And thirdly, why are they, used as a model for developing nations? The reason for this is that the four Asian tigers experienced significant economic growth in the late 20th century, and they became like capitalist economic powerhouses at the end of that by the early 2000s. And they generally have a high level of income, and there are fewer people living in poverty in these countries compared to other countries in Asia and the Southeast Asian region. So this is why we consider them as a model for other Asian economies. Now, what are the economic and cultural strategies that were used by the four Asian tigers? I'll go over the economic strategies because that is more cohesive, and the cultural strategies are a bit different based on the four nations. So basically, the economic strategies are simple. You want to have open trade, you want to have market liberalization. In Singapore, for example, you have very low tax rates, and this is to encourage business within the nation. One of the key economic characteristics is that these were state-led economic projects. So the state invested heavily into research and development and the growth of these large companies, such as Samsung in Korea or TSMC in Taiwan. And as a consequence of that, you had these private corporations amassing a large amount of wealth, even though it was funded using public funds that was given to them by the government. Also, the government would selectively award contracts to these companies that they determined will be the companies that lead these countries to growth in the future. So what that means is the government wouldn't have a meritocratic evaluation of all of the different companies. They just pick Samsung, pick TSMC, and funnel their money into that and make sure that this company gets really, really big and becomes competitive on the global stage. So these are the key economic characteristics of these countries. With regards to the cultural strategies, it broadly links to creating a single national identity aside from separate cultural identities, and this is most evident in Singapore, where you had like Malays, you had Indian Tamils, you had Han Chinese, and a load of different people. But what they tried to do was they tried to create one single Singaporean identity, and that helped in achieving their economic goals due to having a strong national identity that went beyond other like racial or religious identities. So that's like one of the cultural strategies that could be interpreted as being used by the four Asian tigers as well. Now, all of that is sorted, let's get into the cases, and this is going to be very straightforward, and I'll be walking you through the approach by which you come up with arguments as well in this. Okay, let's start with proposition. On proposition, so in any scenario, the best argument for you is to prove that you achieve everything that the other side wants to achieve without doing what they want to do. So you're saying, okay, our case is the best way to achieve the objectives that you want. And that's the strongest argument a proposition can make. Usually it's difficult to make this argument, especially in impromptu motions. But in a prepared motion, that is what you should be striving to do, because you have a week to research and come up with new ideas to create that kind of argument. So probably the first argument that you want to run for proposition is to show that economic prosperity or a strong economy is a precondition for you to have, strong democratic institutions and civil liberties and all of these other things that you have in Western nations. Um, how do you go about proving that? The first question is, how do these institutions come about? And even if these institutions come about, can they be maintained without a strong economy? And there you have your first argument, because having, a right to information act and making sure it's upheld, having civil organizations that keep transparency, that like help uphold transparency within the government, and having an accountable government and having like proper government officials, all of that costs money. And if you come from a situation where you are already a corrupt nation, where you already have a corrupt system of government, it costs even more money to root out the corruption and then establish proper government officers and like proper transparent authorities. And so for that reason, you would argue that economic prosperity is necessary in order for you to establish these institutions in the first place. But think about it from the perspective of the people as well, because the motion already gives you fiat to assume that you cannot have significant four Asian tigers style economic development and strong civil liberties at the same time. It tells you that both of those cannot be done. So then you've got to wonder, will the people be for the establishment of strong civil liberties and human rights protections if they don't have economic prosperity? Like, if unemployment is high, if poverty is high, will these people really be interested in rights like the freedom of expression? Not necessarily. And the problem here is that to establish these rights and to establish these institutions, you need public support, because otherwise they'd vote out the government that's trying to establish these kinds of policies and vote for like a populist government that promises them welfare and economic development anyway. So that what that means is, in order to get the public support necessary for the success of these programs to institute, civil liberties and human rights protections, you need the public to be in a certain state of economic stability, which is something that you don't really see in developing nations. And so that's the key argument that you want to make, to prove that democratic rights are born from economic prosperity. You can link this to Western nations as well, because a lot of these Western economies came from a place of prosperity. It is from a place of prosperity that they started thinking about human rights. And this makes intuitive sense as well, right? Because you don't think about your freedom of expression when you're hungry. At that moment, you think about putting food on the table. And only once your basic needs have been met do you start thinking of other like secondary and tertiary needs, such as your democratic rights and human rights protections for other people that you've never seen and you don't know. So that's the first argument that you want to make. The second argument that you want to make is to question. So the question comes back to, what do people want, right? Do people really want democratic rights, or do they want economic prosperity? And I think in the previous argument, you have proven to some extent that people desire economic prosperity to a greater degree than the democratic rights they have. From that point onwards, you need to prove how you will end up creating economic prosperity, because it's not a given that just because you emulate the economic and cultural strategies of the four Asian tigers, that you will have similar results to the four Asian tigers. So you've got to tell me why these strategies can be generalized and why these strategies will achieve results, even if you're not in like, the unique position that Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong were in. Okay, so how do you actually go about doing that? Well, the first question that you have is, if in fact you have state-led capitalism and the government heavily invests in these corporations, will the money actually trickle down to the public, and will it result in a better standard of living for the working class, or will you just end up making a few oligarchs more prosperous? And this is a significant question that you will have within the debate for sure. So what are the mechanisms by which you can guarantee a trickle down? Well, firstly, if the industries within your nation improve, and one of the key strategies of the four Asian tigers was to invest in industries that have a future, that have like significant growth potential and that are highly in demand. And these industries tend to have a high level of technological literacy required for you to work in these industries. And what that means is that if these companies are going to be successful, the workforce for these companies that lives within your country also needs to be upskilled to that level, which means that as a necessity of having a four Asian tigers model, you will have to like educate your population to ensure that they meet the minimum requirements to actually keep this industry running within the country. But what that means is that these people will be moving into skilled employment. And the word skilled and employment are both important here, because you have like informal economies within these countries where people aren't like properly employed, they don't have proper employment contract, And as a consequence of that, they have no protections, they have no safety net in the case that, whatever job that they're doing, whether they're working as like a day laborer, for example, if that job fails, they don't have any safety net. So employment itself is a big plus, but skilled employment is especially important because it opens more pathways for these people, and it gives them an actual useful skill that will help them earn money even if they're kicked out of this company in some scenario, right? Whether they want to go work for a competitor or whether they want to start their own business, that skill in itself, whether it's manufacturing semiconductors or whether it's assembling computers or something like that, will always be helpful for these individuals. The second thing is that these four Asian tiger nations focused a lot on export oriented industries because, I mean, that's the way that a country makes money, right? You export something and you get money from other people. But the benefit of having export oriented industries is that your currency that you use within the country becomes less volatile to global shocks because you keep on getting foreign currency into your country, and you're not reliant on other forms of stabilization for your currency. What that means is you have less currency volatility, meaning that if there's some kind of global shock happening in the world, you are less likely to see significant inflation within your country. And that level of currency stability in itself is a benefit, even if the money itself from these industries doesn't trickle down to the people. Just the value of the currency that they do have increasing is beneficial for them. But the third thing is that when you have a state led capitalism and when the state has heavy influence over these industries, that also means that the government has leverage over these industries. And then the government can actually ensure that these workers have good working conditions. But then you might ask, well, why does the government care about that? And the simple answer is that the working class is the majority of the population. And if the government wants to get elected in the next term, they need to keep the majority happy. And so the government generally does everything to get re-elected, and so therefore it's very likely that they'll use that leverage they have to create better working conditions for these workers. So overall, what that means is if you have a four Asian tigers style overhaul and you focus on decent industries that the world requires, it will end up having trickle down benefits for the people employed in those industries and in those companies, and also just anyone who uses the currency will benefit from it due to the lower currency volatility. This brings me to the opposition side of things, because I think I'll only be going over like two arguments. You'll probably have a lot of interesting third and fourth arguments. So I'll only be covering the fundamentals since we have time constraints as well. Um, on opposition, the first thing that you want to question is whether the Asian Tigers model is replicable. And I think if you prove that the model can't be replicated, and you require significant, unique, even miraculous circumstances for the four Asian Tigers model to work, you automatically win the debate. So you should always be thinking about pathways to victory when you're making these arguments as well. Like, you need to ask yourself, okay, if this argument succeeds, does that win us the debate? If you make an argument and if every level of that argument succeeding still doesn't win you the debate, it's probably a bad argument. So you should always run your arguments through this test of questioning whether it acts as a pathway to victory. Okay, so can the Asian Tigers model be replicated? Well, there are a few concerns that you can raise surrounding this. The first concern is that in a lot of these cases, these strategies were built around exceptional people. In the case of Samsung, for example, I forget the founder's name, but that family associated with Samsung was an exceptional case, right? They worked across a range of industries even before the government started working with them to take them into tech. They were working in like food, they were working in apparel, and they were working in so many industries, and they were positioned perfectly for the Korean government to fund them to move into semiconductors and electronics and all of that. Similar story with Taiwan. So TSMC is the major company that drove Taiwan's economy, and TSMC was again created only because Maurice Chang was willing to come back down from the US, where he had been working at Texas Instruments, and he came back to found TSMC. And at the time, it was like a revolutionary idea as well, and it was Maurice Chang who had that idea and came with that idea to the Taiwanese government. And then you have Singapore, obviously, where Lee Kuan Yew was less of a human and more like a force of nature. And so that kind of person doesn't get replicated as well if you're thinking about, a country like Sri Lanka, for example. You'll have to ask yourself, can we really replicate that strategy? Do we have the exceptional people to replicate that strategy within this nation? And more often than not, the answer you'll get is no. The second issue with it is that it's a high risk strategy, because even if you have the monetary capacity and the technical capacity to implement it, there's no guarantee that your gamble will pay off. And this is because it also requires the government to be competent as well for the four Asian tiger strategy to work. You see, if South Korea didn't invest in Samsung and the tech industry, and instead it invested in some other random company and the agriculture industry, for example, it would have been a huge failure. And one of the key characteristics of the four Asian tigers model is that you invest a lot of money on one big industry and you stake your entire country's economy upon that. So the question is, to what extent do you trust Asian governments to make a good decision regarding the industry or company that they heavily invest in? Because once you go into that, you can't back out of it. And if the risk doesn't pay off, that's a massive loss for the public. And these countries are already in poor economic situations. So is that a risk that you want to take? The next part of this argument is the comparative, where you try to prove that the Western model is less risky. Okay, but why is the Western model less risky? Well, the first thing is that you want to establish checks and balances against the government. Basically, what you're doing here is you're protecting the government from its own stupidity by having necessary procedures for the government to go through before you can implement a project or before you can make a huge investment. This is why, for example, you always have the government audited. This is why you have parliamentary debates. This is why everything needs to go through, like, 5 to 6 steps of approval before it is completely finalized. And the benefit of having strong institutions is, one, it prevents the misallocation of funds on silly ventures, because you have, like, professionals and academics and other people reviewing these decisions before the government can go ahead with it. But secondly, it also prevents corruption, because it's much harder for a corrupt government official to steal money when their attempt to steal money needs to be approved by around 5 or 6 people. So for that reason, the Western model is less risky. The second thing is that the Western model aims to allow private companies to do their thing and get the auxiliary benefits of that instead of the government heavily being involved. The benefit of this is that you don't play with public funds, you don't play with taxpayer money. Instead, you create a favorable environment for businesses to operate, and if those businesses fail, the public doesn't bear the loss of it. But if these businesses succeed, the public still gets the benefits, such as getting higher employment, and such as all of the other benefits that come about as a result of having a strong export-oriented economy. The cost that the government bears then is the cost of maybe cutting down taxes, or giving favorable land purchase deals to companies to encourage investment and entrepreneurship and foreign direct investment. And also the benefit of this is, if you do this in 2026, you appeal to Western nations, and so therefore you're more likely to get money through programs like USAID or like World Bank grants, for example. And that's also one benefit that you have to consider, because the four Asian tigers model is a very autocratic model, and it's not something that appeals much to the West or the international community in general. This brings me to, like, the second argument, which is, okay, so your first argument is about why the four Asian tiger strategy is likely to fail. I think then the second argument should probably be, okay, but what if the four Asian tigers model actually succeeds? Will it still, achieve all of the benefits that you say it will? Or is even a successful four Asian tigers model still a bad thing? So what are the ways in which you can question or criticize the four Asian tigers model? I think the most straightforward thing is that it creates monopolies within these countries, right? Again, the examples of Samsung and SK Hynix in South Korea, like, a large portion, about 50% of the country's stock market is invested in these two major companies, which means that any kind of volatility within these companies has a significant domino effect on South Korean economy. And you are likely going to be creating that system if you adopt the four Asian tiger strategy in a different nation as well. The problem with having monopolies, in addition to the economic effects, is that they are also impossible to regulate, because you don't want to risk damaging these companies, because damaging these companies damages the economy. So the government absolutely cannot touch them. This is why you've had, like, so many scandals associated with the family that owns Samsung. It's because they have so much power and there's so little that the government can do about it. The second issue with the four Asian tigers model is more of a sort of ethical question that you can raise, which is that the benefits of the four Asian tigers model will take at least a couple of generations to manifest. Like, the Singapore that we see today is only there because of, like, around 30-40 years of sacrifice that people of that generation went through. The problem with this is that the current generation, then, in a country where you implement the 4 Asian Tigers model, is required to sacrifice their life, or sacrifice their youth and sacrifice their freedom, but they're not going to get any benefit out of it, because those benefits will only be experienced by the future generations at the end of the day. And this is especially harmful because the 4 Asian Tigers model necessitates that you put some kind of severe restrictions on these individuals within these countries, right? So, for example, if you're trying to have a high-tech industry, you can't have your educated individuals migrating out of the country, because you want to keep the technical talent within the nation, and so you've got to prevent brain drain, which means you take away a lot of opportunities from talented individuals. But also, you might have to do things such as forced relocation of individuals in order to create space for large scale development projects. Um, you might need to forcibly relocate people to create industries in certain locations. This wasn't something done by the 4 Asian Tigers, this was something done by China, which is different, but it is potentially something that you might need to do. And so, basically, the bottom line of this is that the 4 Asian Tigers model necessarily requires some form of human rights violations, even though these might be comparatively minor human rights. And the people who have their rights violated do not receive anything in return, which makes it a fundamentally unfair model. In comparison, the Western style development strategy ensures that these steps that you take, even if they result in some kind of short term economic harm, at least give these people some kind of benefit in terms of the civil liberties that they receive. Because by nature, having freedom of expression means that everyone gets freedom of expression, and they at least have that even though they don't have economic prosperity. And so it's a much more fairer and equitable system where the benefits are distributed amongst the population, and immediate benefits are experienced by the people who work and sacrifice them for economic progress. So those are like the two arguments that I have for opposition as well. As usual, if you all have any questions, you can leave it in the comments, though I have never seen anyone raising any questions in the comments. So I can only assume that this debrief has been successful, and all debriefs in the past have also been successful. Thank you for sticking around so long till the end of the video, and I hope to see you all in another series of debriefs.